Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second season of the Traveling Métis podcast, the podcast that dives headfirst into Métis culture. I am your host, Samantha Loney. We're back with a bunch of great guests, so pop in your headphones, grab your paddle, and hop into that canoe. We're about to head down the river to visit with my fellow Métis. Last season, I had a great time traveling across Turtle Island, talking to Métis people about what being Métis means to them. We laid the foundations for Métis art and culture, but I realized I neglected to highlight not only an important part of Métis culture, but Indigenous culture at large, our two-spirited community. Last year, thanks to my guest, Nika Pazook, we got a sliver of what should have been a bigger conversation.
Two-Spirit people and Métis, we share a lot, especially specifically Métis Two-Spirit people. I think they really, truly are all about balance. They really are walking in those two worlds and really understanding what it means to be both, but neither at the same time. And I think that's so cool. I think, honestly, we have so much to learn from Two-Spirit people.
Nika is right. There is so much that two-spirited people can teach us. As Métis, a lot of us struggle with identity, trapped in a void between our settler and native roots. But does it have to be a struggle? Is there a way we can achieve balance between both worlds? Who can we look to for guidance on these issues? Nika had a great suggestion. What if we looked to our two-spirited kin? That's why I wanted to make sure I did an entire episode on two-spirited people and their role and importance in Native culture. The first person I thought of was two-spirited artist Rihkee Strapp. Rihkee is a Red River Métis born in Red Lake, Ontario, who grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, which is where I met them. They were giving a presentation at a conference called 2Spirit, From Time Immemorial to the Future. It was day 2 of the conference, and Rihkee opened with a joke. They said, Two-Spirit people are the closest to creator and creation. So since we're talking about being Two-Spirit and two-spirited people, if you want to just give maybe a definition of what that means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a very specific perspective myself, but I think it's also really important to put it within a historical context as well. So the term Two-Spirit came from a conference in Winnipeg in 1990. And up until that point, a lot of anthropologists and historians, which would, generally be settler descent folks, would be using a derogatory term in their analysis of these people. So the term Two-Spirit came about to represent those traditional roles within these different nation societies, as well as all-encompassing the LGBTQ plus spectrum as well. And so that's kind of the origin of Two-Spirit. For me, that's a very specific and important definition, I think, because I would see it often getting conflated exclusively with a third gender or a gender identity. And I think it's really important to understand that gender itself is a concept that predominantly came from European descendant cultures. And there's actually really a lot of great essays about the coloniality of gender. And when we start thinking of Two-Spirit specifically within this context, I think it really erases some of the worldview that's associated with those various roles across many nations.
Yeah, because I remember in your talk, you were talking about a lot of people associate Two-Spirit with sexuality and things like that too. So I think a lot of people like even me specifically, like not being two-spirited, there's a lot of misinformation, and depending on where you're getting your information, you might be getting different definitions. So,
and I think that's an overarching problem in the LGBTQ plus community in general. In my talk, which is called 2Spirit from Time Immemorial to the Future, I did what I call a Wikipedia recap of the kind of legal history within Canada specifically. And we see that as soon as the settlers arrive, it becomes like punishable through the law, and the punishment is death. And like as we move through this history, the term socio-psychopathic sexual criminal, which was originally attributed to gay men, and this would be like really fueling the gay purge that took place in Canada as well. And then we see this like pattern of dehumanization repeating itself throughout history, but now especially as more human rights protecting gender and transgender people are going through. We're seeing this backlash and dehumanization process happening again.
Because I remember in your talk, you also said you didn't know if Métis people could even be two-spirited at one point.
I think that's connected to growing up in Northern Ontario as well, because I just didn't have like any awareness, like affirming terms. And I also used terms that like nowadays would be considered slurs to identify myself. So like the more affirming terms I learned when I grew up, and I moved to Toronto for 1 year for a fellowship. And I started using like the terms like gender fluid and then non-binary. And then I finally settled on 2Spirit, and more specifically a Yakweo. And yeah, the identity was definitely shaped by like my friends and elders that I've talked to. And the real turn in adapting the term 2Spirit actually came from my friend Candace. Because yeah, at the time I'm like, I don't actually like, is this a First Nations term, or is this like for the Indigenous umbrella? So I was like, I'm not gonna use things that I like don't know and don't understand. But she kind of came up to me and she was like, I think you're this thing. And it just kind of like spurred that discussion. And it was really the community that was like identifying me, which I really appreciated. I'm still in touch with a lot of them. But at the time when we were all kind of living together and hanging out in the same place, we were all learning Anishinaabe-Mowen. I would say even though it was in like the Sioux, there's so many language teachers from Wiki, so we'd learn like the fast way of talking. And it was just really cool because that language uses singular they pronouns. I just think that's cool, and I like that approach as well. Especially when I think about like our clans and our helpers, and depending on like your background, those various things. I like the idea of like they as identifying myself in connection with all of them. So I don't know. I love thinking about it that way. Though for me personally, I'm not super strict about pronouns, just because like a lot of the elders I hang out with and my family, they might like fumble over it. But for me, I just kind of like was like, there's a lot more important things in the world related to that history of violence, that although it's like kind of a microaggression, it's most of the time not people's intention to hurt. So it's not really something I take too seriously.
I personally, like, I have a little story, but I come from poor people. And I had not even lice, I had like fleas at one point. Like, that's how poor we were. That I had fleas, and my dad had to give me a haircut, and I got misgendered all the time because I was a bit chunky and I had short hair. So everybody thought I was a little boy. So for me personally, I hated that experience. So for me, that's always like a fear of mine, is misgendering people, just from that like personal childhood trauma of like, okay, like I did not like when I was a child, and this happened to me. So I think, like you said, like it's a personal like experience, right?
And that's like, I think a really important point is that like literally everyone is different. There's like an infinity inside of all of our minds, and we may have like a lot of overlap, but like everyone is different. I think like an event around pronouns in your youth that's like that is absolutely so significant. For me, it's just like it happens so often that I'm kind of just numb to it. And it's like I can let this frustrate me endlessly, and that can be my life. But it's too often. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and it's not something that I'm in control of. So it's kind of like that for my own like mental wellness, need to let it go. But yeah, I think a lot of people, it is really significant. So it's really important just to respect people who for who they are as individuals.
Yeah, and so you talked about being identified as two-spirit and like that connection to community, because for a lot of Indigenous people, like, yeah, it is ancestral, but it's also having that community acceptance. Growing up in Northern Ontario, since there are a lot more reserves and it's not as urbanized, did you think it was easier for you to, in your experience as an Indigenous person, to connect to your indigeneity?
I think it's a really interesting perspective because I grew up in Northern Ontario, but then I also moved down south. I think like the fact that it's both conservative and Indigenous actually makes it easier for me to move around as a white-skinned Native person. Because of like racism and like colorism, I just found it a lot easier to be accepted in a lot of places and spaces that maybe like their own community members had a difficult time with. And I've talked to some of my like older like auntie friends about this as well. I would say like I'm in the Northwest growing up predominantly, like between Red Lake and like Sault Ste. Marie. And like my sister was in Timmins, and we lived in like South Porcupine for a while. So it's like a little bit northeast, but I think it's mostly like the Northwest is the experience that I'm like most familiar with. In Red Lake, there's no historical like Métis communities, so I definitely mostly hung out with like Ojibwe and like OG Cree folks. I really appreciated the communities and the peoples that accepted me. Like, there's just so much knowledge and like brilliance that I've been allowed to like witness and see on like Anishinaabe, and I'm just like really grateful to be in this area. But I have had to go to the south like a couple times just because it's like an economic hub and I need to survive. And there's also a lot of really great free education opportunities within the arts sector that just didn't exist up north. So I have like spent a year living there. And during that time, I was able to go through the Studio Y Fellowship with the Mars Discovery District, and through that organization was able to go to the Vital Signs Luncheon and hear the Vital Signs Report. And they actually laid out, over half the population is racialized. A lot of folks are immigrants, but they are just not experiencing the same economic prosperities that their like white counterparts were. So it was just like the presenter on stage, he was just trying to like desperately explain to the crowd how like we had been getting to this real tipping point of like racial inequity, and that we had at this point gone over it. And this was in Toronto. And so what I kind of realized at that point was that a lot of these problems are not localized to Northern Ontario, and through a lot more of like just education with really brilliant Black Friend Leagues, learning more about like global colonization and like how those systems all work together. And I was realizing quickly, like, there's Indigenous people everywhere and there's colonizers everywhere. This is a global issue.
Because I was talking to some American friends who are Indigenous, and they're like, yeah, like some Americans don't even think that Native Americans even exist anymore. So I think that is part of the problem with the inequity with Indigenous people specifically.
Yeah, like even as like a Canadian born person, like I have like had snippets of the history in the States. Like I was gifted Winona LaDuke's book, The Militarization of Indian Country. A lot of it was just talking about how the forts set up across America engaged in like firing ranges and just point blank shot tons of people, which I think contributes to that fiction that like Indigenous people in the States no longer exist. And then there was this process of displacement where they slowly moved a lot of nations across the East Coast, and I think some in Michigan as well, into like a reserve in like the middle of the states. And it's like the very definition of Indigenous is about our relation and connection to our like land and our historical land and the relationship that we had cultivating and protecting and working with it and sacrificing for it. So to take these people that, you know, are working on these specific schedules that are specific to their region and just to plop them down, like lumping all Indigenous people together and plopping them down in one reserve, which is why you have like so many different nations in this one cluster on this one large res in the middle of the states.
People don't understand there are different tribes, there are different languages. They all think like, oh, if you're Indigenous in North America or Canada, like you're the same as another Indigenous person.
Yeah, and I think it's just a really lazy thing to do. And I think it becomes really problematic. And I think it ends up reinforcing that colorism that I was discussing earlier. Like, I keep thinking sometimes, like, if we could just not use the term Indigenous or Native or any of these umbrella terms and just like know who we are. I'm a Red River Métis. I'm like descendant from Treaty 4 signatories, the Naheapwat, the Iron Confederacy.
I think that's a lot for the government to, they'd rather you just check off Indigenous than be like, I'm from, and then like list off like your family history.
I think it's the same issues actually happen a lot in the 2Spirit LGBTQ plus community, though. We're constantly stuck at educating at the 101 level. And it needs to like go deeper for people to understand how these things actually work, because they're way more like nuanced. My talk, I had this image that I had found that was looking specifically at like anatomical sex, gender identity, and gender expression, because other models, which I also think, you know, were infantile and created for children, or, you know, younger people, anatomical sex as like a point that is male, a point that is female, and a point that is intersex. And in my talk, I'm like, there's actually a spectrum. And that image itself is even flattening that nuance, because within that anatomical sex spectrum, there is a ton of different variables that themselves are spectrums. They aren't simple. But I like I said before, I think for me, the way that I simplify it and I get to know them without, you know, worrying about making mistakes, I just assume I don't know and I ask.
Living in both like Southern Ontario and Northern Ontario, do you think there are any specific struggles to being two-spirited in the North that are different from, say, just a general being two-spirit, like in an urban environment in a city?
I think that really complicates a lot of my like concepts around like regional sovereignty, because I really think like the nations whose lands we are on, like we don't need to wait for governments to recognize their sovereignty. So like taking jobs in a different region, like what local Indigenous person am I taking that job away from? But colonialism making like Toronto an economic like epicenter, we're also kind of like the land up here is getting extracted from to support that. Like in Sault Ste. Marie specifically, formerly and also known as Bawatang, There's like tons of solar farms, and a lot of that energy is actually sold to Southern Ontario. So there's like a lot extraction taking place on these lands that go to the south.
Is there anything we can do better to support two-spirited people that are in our communities?
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't already know about that Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus history, where you are in the settler state that you live in, to like really learn that, because I think it puts things in context first. Because if we're talking about making a better future, we have to think, what are the wrongs of the past that we need to amend? Because that will really direct our work and like how we approach it. I talked about the criminalization and the kind of extreme dehumanization. So like, what are the opposites of that? Like, how do we show and create love and care for our Two-Spirit family and not replicate the violence of the past? And one of the ways that the violence of the past happened is the erasure of Two-Spirit identities. And it's actually a really interesting history in Canada, specifically as an artist, because when you go to art school, you have to do art history. And you learn that a lot of the early European artists that were either commissioned by the church or, you know, working with early explorers, both in the States and Canada, talk to each other, were disgusted by the Two-Spirit that they saw and how it was accepted and just out in the open, and no one was worried about it. So there's actually correspondence from George Catlin, who ironically also like painted the dance of the Burdosh, which is showing one of those ceremonies. But he's like, I won't tell you what nation this comes from. Do not paint these people. Do not draw these people. The record of them needs to be extinguished and not recorded. So I think, what is the amends that needs to be made for that? It means inclusion and recognition of those identities in all aspects of life. So when we're talking about arts councils, historic institutions, campaigns to tell our stories, we need to make sure that we're including those Two-Spirit stories. We need to make those stories very visible, those histories very visible, and mapping out the current histories that are also happening with like Two-Spirit people that are doing amazing things.
One of those amazing two-spirited people is Cecil Young Fox, an acclaimed woodland painter of Ojibwe and Métis ancestry from Blind River. Woodland painting is one of the most notable styles of Native art, with bold lines and X-ray views of bright, colorful, figurative images within the paintings. Cecil was given the Aboriginal Order of Canada and had succeeded in popularizing Native art. We should be shouting Cecil Young Fox from the rooftops and spreading knowledge of this great two-spirited artist. But unpacking the contributions of two-spirited people to our culture and history is just the beginning. There is so much more we need to do.
The kind of first thing is like mental health supports. And I think that's really crucial. And me personally, I'm always pushing for like peer support circles, ongoing therapy support, but that's also gender affirming care, both temporary, like supplying binders, but also medical, like financial support for medical transitioning, and like making sure that we have enough Two-Spirit therapists, because they're asked for specifically and sought after specifically because of our higher rates of these struggles and the need for that specific understanding in service providers so that they can help us. There's so much history to learn about. Like October 26th, the Canadian Bar Association sections were repeating the call for a public consultation on surgery for intersex children, which coincides with Intersex Awareness Day, because like it's been the standard for decades to have non-consensual, deferrable, and medically unnecessary surgeries happening on intersex children to make them fit And it's incredibly traumatic for a number of reasons. I can't think of any case where it's appropriate to ask someone about like their genitals unless you're intimate with them, but it's a story that you'll actually hear over and over again with two-spirit and trans folks. Like I've personally had it happen to me at an innovation center, and it was really depressing because the man who asked me about my genitals in the middle of a business meeting, his daughter was doing a research paper on trans people. So I was just really floored that like I was like, you need to read your daughter's research, because like it's so inappropriate to ask anybody that. And I think in terms of privacy, like I think in most cases it's also inappropriate to just ask people about their medical history, like unless they're like willingly sharing that information and you have that intimate relationship, because it's not usually something people want people to pry about. Um yeah, and then a lot of people will also like change their name from their birth name, and like they don't necessarily want to tell you what their birth name was if they like intentionally changed it. And I think it's also important to like educate ourselves on like what terms are outdated and offensive so we can avoid using them. We can avoid those microaggressions. But like when a slip up happens, a long-winded apology can actually like be way more awkward than just being like a quick correction and actually move on from the issue completely.
Yeah, instead of making like a giant scene where everybody's like listening and
Yeah, like it's ridiculous. Like I can't tell you how many long-winded like apologies I've gotten just like in the past 2 months regarding my pronouns, and I literally don't care.
I think that's a lot. That says a lot about like the person. And it's like, okay, now you're taking that issue from the person who you misgendered, and now you're making it about you, where it's like, I have to apologize and I feel the need to do this. Like,
there's like these 5 pillars of like white supremacy, which is like the cornerstone of colonialism. And one of them is perfectionism. And I think what a lot of these people who over apologize and people who try to be the best ally of all time is that like you can't actually be perfect. And it's really about how you act when you make the mistake, because it is inevitable, regardless of your identity and experiences. I really reject this idea of perfectionism, but I can respect that, you know, we're all like within the system and really inundated with these messages, and just like respecting people where they're at.
you did some work designing the two-spirited Metis sash. And for people who don't know, the Metis sash historically has had like a lot of different uses. It's multi-use. But I think in modern day, the Metis sash is a big, I know when I wear it and another Métis person sees me, it's a nice identifier of who is Métis. So why was it important to design a specific sash that is for two-spirited people?
So like part of like designing the sash is like the veterans have a sash, the youth have a sash, the women have a sash. And the various sashes could say like if you're English speaking or French speaking, and they have all this this like cultural encoding within the colors and the stitches, which is also exciting, because I think there's a lot of talk about various Indigenous nations being these like oral history keepers, but a lot of it is actually in images and textile and pattern. So the sash that we created has specific colors that kind of relate to what we understand two-spirit identity to mean for us. So I'll just jump into the colors. Purple is just like a spiritual color, and there's just like part of the experience of being this way at this point in time is that it's very difficult. So we have these extra spiritual gifts just to support us on that somewhat more difficult path. And so there's a lot of rules around us helping a community relate to one another, which I think is a kind of secular way of like looking at spirituality, is like how we relate to one another, how we relate to the larger group, how we relate to the universe. So that like work of like going between different sides and hearing everyone's kind of sides and the different roles that we had in community, we were able to kind of piece together a lot of like the accountability processes and the peacemaking internally, as well as like taking care of children. A lot of babysitting was done by 2Spirit people. So a lot of the purple and the white is like referencing those spiritual gifts. And then there's also lots of greens. There's actually two different types of greens and blues. And this is specifically about our responsibility to care for and protect the land and water. And I think that's really crucial because we're living in modernity. We have a lot of these like extraction projects that I talked about. We have a lot of communities in the north talking about doing nuclear storage. And we have to be really serious about protecting the land and water. And it's not just about making money to resource our programs, because the land and the water is our wealth. So we have to make that a priority. And so the colors establish that priority. And then there's also like the 4 directions colors. And that has to do with alliances to the First Nations that we share territories with, because like there's a lot of shared territories here. And we have to make sure that we maintain those alliances. And then we also talked about the Black having a dual meaning of the dark times in 2S LGBTQ plus history, like the gay purge and a lot of the violence that we're seeing now against trans people and the AIDS crisis. That was like 47,000 Canadian lives that passed away during that. So we also have to kind of hold that grief in that history and respect those people who lost lives. Like, you know, a lot of these problems we aren't worrying as much as about. So like holding that space for them. So that was just a really exciting project to be a part of. And now we have interim 2S LGBTQ plus council within the MNO and hoping to solidify our charter soon. So that's really exciting.
It's nice to have a council so that we don't forget about those issues.
If people aren't integrating 2S LGBTQ plus identities into various systems, it completely skews our data collection. Like in the evaluation world, there's this quote that you'll hear a lot, and it's no stories without stats and no stats without stories. And a lot of people who experience this violence end up to go on experience more violence when they get misgendered through the justice system. They get misgendered in the media. And then, you know, people aren't understanding exactly how big this problem of violence is. Shout out to my old coworker, Shauna, bringing in these like Indigenous innovation expert. They show like what is like the most impactful thing that you can do to make a community level paradigm shift. And it always starts with forming these niche groups, and then from these niche groups defining their issues and defining their own solutions, you create policy. And then from that, you create the events and the programming that, you know, both niche groups and the public are able to participate in. And then you have everyone having that education, that policy protection, and it's created by the group that it's meant to serve. And it's really funny because that's how it's explained within like systems innovation. But then within like the grassroots world, that's just called centering the most oppressed. So yeah, it's just really cool to see a lot of that grassroots observation and like high data analysis coming to the same conclusions, and then seeing how different people are like literally taking that work and doing it on the ground.
You describe yourself as a socially engaged artist. I can probably figure out what that means for myself, but when you describe yourself as that, what does that mean for you, and what does like your artwork entail?
It depends like kind of what circle you're hanging out in, because like there's some people will call it socially engaged art, some people will call it community arts, and every kind of weird name has its kind of like own nuance and approach to it. But for me, it means like heavily involving people in my processes and often in my presentation of the work I'm making. One of the projects I did, I think in like 2016, was I was like just going to different spots around downtown Sault Ste. Marie and just like building shelters. So like I would be in an alleyway across from where I used to live when I was like 20 years old. And I just start like building a wigwam out of like there was like these giant thistle plants and some construction cones. And I was working with like a Métis youth on it because I love involving young people just because it's like, especially in Northern Ontario, like making sure you have opportunities to build your CV as an artist so that you can go ahead and have access to those grants yourself as a young person. Like, I just really like making those opportunities available. We would create like visual art together. We would create community plays to like show off the art, and organize like a drag workshop with the esthetician program at Sioux College. So you'd arrive and you'd get like a free transformation, and you could like tell the esthetician like student like how you wanted to be transformed. And this amazing drag queen at the time, Gia Diamond, comes in like an oversized t-shirt with like a mustard stain on it and like friggin' like gym shorts, and like in front of everyone does their transformation process, giving like, these are all the products I'm using, this is how I'm applying them, and just like turns into this like beautiful woman. So that was fabulous. And then the more community arts, social practice, socially engaged part is for the participants that were comfortable, we flash mobbed a bus to a metal show that I also organized downtown. And then Gia Diamond did a lip sync in the middle of the metal show. At the time, like, everyone had a lot of perceptions about metalheads being violent and aggressive because it's a small town in Northern Ontario. We had to spend an extra $500 on insurance for that event. So bringing in the drag queens to like have a really good time and take a lot of pictures together was saying like, we are literally just people who are enjoying culture. Like, culture is great. Please enjoy it.
I saw that you had done some like AR stuff recently too. I was like recently part of like the IM4 lab where we had worked on like virtual productions and stuff like that. Is that like something you like are going to keep exploring or?
Oh my gosh, I love this question, and I love that you're involved with that org because I follow them and they're so cool. And yeah, like I absolutely am so interested in AR. I had downloaded Spark AR in 2020, but I just like I didn't have the mentorship to kind of do what I wanted to do. Like one of my favorite AR artists right now is he goes by Ken XO. And I believe he's based in Japan, but he actually did some pieces in the Vancouver mural festival. What I really want to do is like start adding like AR elements to like my old paintings. So a lot of it is like 2D animations. It could be layered to have like a 3-dimensional aspect. But yeah, I just could not figure it out for the life of me. I did just re-download it and I'm trying to do it again. But like I get really like panicky when I go to like institutionalized education. So I've been doing a lot more like residencies and a couple month workshops, but it's not the same as like an educational intensive. I really aspire to one day make the art assets and maybe help with like the story character development on like an indie video game.
Being part of like IM4, we use Unreal Engine and we were all making Indigenous films, and like the lack of Indigenous assets is like astonishing. So, and we were having like a debate about it's like, well, if we create these assets, then do non-Indigenous people get to use these and create non-Indigenous stories and things like that? So it's
we love our protocols, so we'd have to make asset protocols, and you have to get initiated into our game lodge to get access to them. And only if you're a level 7 initiate do you get access to them all. The very sacred pixels.
Oh my god. Just, yeah, Indigenous people taking over the virtual world now. Like,
Yeah, and no, that's important though. It really is. Like, and we need Indigenous coding languages and like Indigenous AI, because we look at all of these technologies and they're really exciting, but there is absolutely like a very narrow demographic that's predominantly working in these fields, and it's absolutely going to repeat itself within whatever they create. And that means whatever we create will reproduce our worldviews and our ideologies. Through making a seat at the table, I got to kind of dive deep into like some of the history of like Indigenous new media, and just like Imaginative as a film festival has invested in like helping artists like navigate these new mediums to try out new exciting things. And then this last festival, there was like so much like AR and like creative platforms.
you talked a bit about how your work and how you do help other Northern Ontario artists. Like, is there anything that we can do to sort of help like artists from the North, or if there's any like specific struggles maybe we're not aware of besides, I guess, like geography and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm actually in Sudbury right now working with a team of just like really cool Ojibwe women. I'm working with Cora Ray Silk, who is an amazing arts administrator, to co-found a new institution. Basically, we have been like an art collective going under the name Northern Indigenous Artists Alliance since about 2018. And we recently got funding to incorporate, and we didn't have to, but we were kind of hemming and hawing about like, because there's a lot of freedom as a collective, but then there's a lot more resources that we can start distributing within our like specific communities if we incorporate. And the Northern Indigenous Artists Alliance is specifically a support organization to support regional art collectives. So like, we're not trying to go into any community and like organizing and do things for people, but rather we do a lot of gatherings and bringing people together, finding out what their needs are and how we can connect and kind of resource those things. We're also really interested in having more Southern audiences like know who our artists are working up here, because a lot of it has to do with like people want to stay in the communities. They want to stay on their First Nations reserve. They want to be around their families. They want to be around their elders. They want to be on their land, but they still want to make art, and they still want to, support art being created. So I want to support the creation of this organization. I'm going to be helping out with some of the fundraising. So, follow Nia on Facebook and Instagram, and donate to our fundraiser, follow the different artists that we promote. I'd also love to give like a shout out to like Cities Studios in Thunder Bay, because we work with them a lot, and you should just donate to them and check out their artists too, because they are really aspiring to get a physical space where they can host their collective, which is all focused on Indigenous youth in Thunder Bay doing cultural and arts workshops and projects together. They do like drum making, beading, giant murals, screen printing, like whatever the youth are into. For Southern Ontario folks that aren't kind of aware of the dynamic, a lot of like the fly-in reserves in like the far north, there's no high schools there. So when the youth turn friggin' 14, they have to move to Thunder Bay and get a place by their friggin' selves. So these kinds of programs, having their own physical infrastructure where they can feel safe and lead those spaces themselves, are really crucial. So you should check out Cities Studios. Also in Thunder Bay is Nijayek Alliance. And there's a lot of like Indigenous pride collectives that have like formed on their reserves. So just like, like check people out, send them money, check out their art. It's really cool. There's great stories up here. So it's just really important to really check out the rates and the standard practices because, it's a real struggle up here for people to just understand how the sale of art works sometimes and like copyright and copyright buyout. Making sure that people are paid a legitimate wage is really important if you want as a southern organization to work in the north. Establish those relationships over a long period of time before you start coming up here, because again, going back to that extraction and that resourcing of the south, you have to understand that there's a really awkward power dynamic that gets created when you have the resources and ability to lead here and we do not.
You mentioned the importance of supporting Northern artists so that they could stay in their communities as well if they choose to, because I feel like as an artist, you yourself are your art. So when you're taken out of your community, just the way you're expressing yourself and the way you grew up and your traditions and your culture all goes into who you are as a person, and then that goes into your art. So it's your art would kind of change depending on where you go as well too. So to be able to stay in your community and express yourself and stay with your traditions and your teachings is a great benefit to your art.
That's so true. That is so true. And I think nothing is more reflective within my own practice than the fact that I never really touched the woodland art style. My sister painted in the woodland art style way longer than I have. I didn't get into it until I moved back to not my hometown, but I ended up living in Koshner, which is I think a village or a hamlet, kind of 2 towns over. And it was down the street from Norville Morisseau's basement studio when he used to work at the mine there. In the 70s, there was the Triple K cooperative. So a lot of people have really iconic silk screen from the first generation of woodland artists that Morisseau was a part of, which includes the Kakapedum family and the Kakagamics, who were part of the co-founders of the Triple K cooperative, which was also an Indigenous-led silkscreen cooperative way back when, without the internet. It was just pretty amazing. And there was one book that was written about them, which was the production of it was discontinued. So that's another, not just 2Spirit stories being based, but Indigenous-led arts organizations' histories being erased as well. So I think I always tell that story over and over again.
You have to, so people don't forget.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, wait, what was the original question? I feel I said so much context, I lose my point sometimes.
Your art is reflective of who you are and where you're from. So if you're removed from your community.
Yeah, so basically what happened was after that, I lived in Toronto for a year. And so all of that stuff from my hometown was bubbling up. And I painted a woodland series. But I found that over the years, not being there anymore, the urge to do that has just kind of waned. I'm really interested in how can I also use a lot of those sensibilities within other mediums than visual art. So thinking about how important color is in terms of light and not just paint, and how to put stories mnemonic devices within my art that's not necessarily just a painting. So I still find myself really inspired by that approach, and the early woodland artists, they were still so connected to the visual language of the pictographs, whereas now it's a lot more decorative. You'll see a lot of people using symbols and it looks very pretty. It's very much a language that you can write in, and a lot of the early artists were making, they look like animals but they're actually maps. And the specific lines would show how many times you would visit that specific island to participate in a specific ceremony. It's the same way that we culturally encode the sash. And I think it's really frustrating for me when people talk about oral histories, it was the pictographs, the same way that like the Egyptians had hieroglyphs. And I really love studying both hieroglyphs and pictographs because it's like the image has so many layers of information and multitudes of meanings depending how things are arranged. That it's just like, it's really fascinating to learn about. There's other woodland artists that are currently working in this specific way now. Like, I think I would reference like Bonnie Devine and one of my collaborators, Mishi Kinkwe, Turtle Woman. She shares a lot of posts about young people that wrote love letters. Like a woman who wrote a love letter to someone using this pictographic language that she had learned from her parents. So like being around that is like absolutely like very inspiring. But yeah, so like as I move through the world, my art and my relation to things and styles like changes a lot. And I am so nomadic like the past 2-3 years that I think like a lot of my art is about the internet because that is like the only kind of consistent point. And I think it's also really important, especially right now with the things that are coming to light about the Congo and like where our the resources that make our technology come from. And I really love Dr. Suzanne Kite. I can't remember exactly the essay, but I reference it in Making a Seat at the Table, where she says that we have to consider that like AI, like a lot of technology that is in this ephemeral liminal space is actually very much connected to like real materials and real land bases in the real world. And I'm gonna like butcher this quote, but it's like AI in this regard becomes us creating relationships with exploited resources. So I think like exploited land, exploited people, these are a lot of the themes that also make sense when we talk about like just like the amount of people that got rich off a pandemic that made so many people so poor. So it just seems like it's the most relevant to me right now.
Yeah, you told us you were in Sudbury working on that artist collective and things like that. But is there anything else you're working on or you'd like to promote, or even just where people can find your art and support you?
Yeah, absolutely. So Keowaywen, I'm working to have that be exhibited eventually at the Thunder Bay Art Gallery. You can check out my website, rihkeestrapp.ca, to kind of follow up with all my projects. It's rihkeestrapp.ca. And part of Keowaywen is like visiting everybody and talking about everything. So I also started a podcast, but it's it's under my clown persona, Misqua, the mad clown who spreads the prophecy that comes through the internet. So that podcast is called The Medfax, and I'm hoping to launch the very first episode on all podcast platforms. And there's going to be like a vlog video version on YouTube. So you can see my great clown makeup. So in the first episode, I basically just introduce myself and the prophecy that Misqua, the mad clown, has discovered. But in subsequent episodes, I'm actually going to be interviewing different artists that are based in Northern Ontario, Indigenous, and mostly 2Spirit, because that's the people I know.
Great. Well, that's how we can, support and learn more about Northern Ontario artists and 2-spirited artists is, checking out your podcast. So that's great.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on yours. I'm really grateful that you gave me this time to speak today.
I want to thank Rihkee for helping me start this season off in a good way. I will leave a link to Rihkee's website and the art collectives we discussed in the episode's show notes. Please check those out and donate to them if you can. Merci for listening, and we'll see you down the river. This episode was written and directed by Samantha Loney, with music composed by Etienne Beausoleil, edited by Cassidy Villebron Baracus, and produced by the Métis and Me program, with support from our sponsors, 880 Cities and the Ontario Changemakers program, along with the Métis Nation of Ontario's Culture-Based Economic Development Grant. Make sure to like and subscribe for more episodes.